Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here, and special welcome to Professor Andrew Lakoff. Professor Lakoff is in sociology and anthropology at the University of Southern California. So we are one now, all part of the Big Ten. So didn't even have to go outside the Big Ten for this one. Andrew also directs the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life at USC. And he has a number of books that he's written. He has a 2017 book called Unprepared: Global Health in a Time of Emergency, a 2021 book entitled The Government of Emergency: Vital Systems Expertise and the Politics of Security, and then a recent book just from last year, Planning for the Wrong Pandemic, COVID-19 and the Limits of Expert Knowledge. So thank you very much for being here, Andrew. If there are other things you want to add about yourself, you're welcome to do that. And we look forward to your presentation.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I also would like to thank Christine Wank for introducing me to the group, and also Alessandra for all of her help in organizing this event. As I mentioned to Paul, I'm sorry that I can't attend in person, but I'm really excited that I'm able to have this exchange virtually now. Speaking of the Big Ten, I guess if this were a basketball or a football game, I would not be able to do this via Zoom. But happily, we're just exchanging intellectual ideas. So I'm going to present some new and therefore perhaps a little bit choppy work in the hopes of getting some nice feedback from you all. The talk builds on a book that Paul mentioned that I published a few years ago with Stephen Collier that's called The Government of Emergency. And the book examines how the vulnerability of vital systems to potentially catastrophic events became an object of knowledge and intervention in the United States during the mid-20th century. And my talk today will move into the present and look at a particular vital system, the infrastructure of water provision in California, in relationship to its vulnerability to climate change. And the talk asks how emergency as a political administrative construct is used to govern the flow of water in California. So let me begin with a concept that you've probably heard of, the concept of climate emergency, which has been embraced in recent years by scientists and citizens groups as a way to call attention to a situation in which urgent action is required to reduce or halt climate change, as Oxford University defined the concept when naming it as the word of the year a few years ago. And in 2019, the journal Bioscience published a statement signed by 11,000 scientists declaring clearly and unequivocally that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. As of the fall of 2024, over 2,000 jurisdictions in 40 countries representing 1 billion people had declared a climate emergency. Now, without making a judgment as to the political efficacy of such calls for action, let me just point to a certain paradox in this formulation of climate emergency. On the one hand, climate change is an inexorable and ongoing process, irreversibly transforming our conditions of existence. On the other hand, the concept of emergency suggests a sudden and disruptive event, after which, if we've responded adequately, we should be able to return to a prior condition of normalcy. So in this talk, I want to ask how this temporal paradox is dealt with in the practice of governing actual climate emergencies. And my focus here is on emergency, not as a call for action, but rather as a political administrative category. That is the use of official governmental declarations of emergency to put government on a different footing. Just for instance, during the recent coronavirus pandemic, under the aegis of a federal public health emergency, a specific clause in the law that regulates the introduction of new medicines was triggered by the declaration of emergency so that the experimental use of novel treatments could be more easily authorized. So just to give you an instance of how emergency as a administrative construct may be used. In this book that I mentioned earlier, Stephen Collier and I describe a threefold historical transformation in the concept of emergency government, beginning in the mid-20th century. First, rather than pointing to a demand for sovereign decision outside of the law as the political theorist Carl Schmitt famously advocated, the state of emergency was incorporated into the procedures of normal governance. Second, the prospect of future emergency became a site of iterative planning in which officials enacted or simulated possible futures, mapped vulnerabilities in critical systems, and then targeted gaps in preparedness. And then finally, third, this concept extended its purview from its initial site of reference, an exceptional threat to sovereignty, specifically the prospect of a nuclear attack during the Cold War. The concept was extended to a range of potential future events, including natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and outbreaks of infectious disease. So today, as the legal scholar Kim-Lane Shepley has argued, declarations of emergency have been regularized, routinized, and taken into normal constitutional practice. So just in the year 2024, there were numerous federal and state emergency declarations in response to wildfires, hurricanes, floods, the spread of bird flu, the opioid crisis, and even the solar eclipse in Texas. And that was to deal with parking issues, apparently. So as opposed to the colloquial use of the concept of crisis, which serves to differentiate past and future and mark a moment of rupture, of transformation, emergency as a governmental category suspends time. It carves out a circumscribed period of exception to the norm that will, it is supposed, be followed by a return to the status quo. This temporally bound structure of emergency sits uneasily with the experience of climate change as a condition of ongoing transformation. For this reason, in thinking about how the climate emergency is being addressed, I think we should look not at public injunctions to action, like the ones that I cited earlier, but rather at the use of emergency government to understand and manage specific climate-related events, like droughts, wildfires, or floods. And so here in this talk, I'm going to look at the experience of water scarcity, focusing on a recent period of extreme drought in California. As some of you may remember, the period from 2020 to 2022 was the driest 3-year period in California's recorded history. Higher temperatures linked to global warming turned what would have been a relatively ordinary drought in the cycle of drought and deluge of California into an exceptional one. In the midst of this period, in May 2021, amid near-empty reservoirs, overtaxed aquifers, and fallowed fields, rural lawmakers called on Governor Gavin Newsom to declare an official statewide drought emergency. They hoped that such a declaration would make it possible to suspend environmental regulations requiring that water be kept in rivers to protect endangered fish, and to instead increase diversions of water to aid struggling farmers in the Central Valley. But others opposed the use of an emergency declaration to shift the state's scarce water supplies to agricultural interests, asking whether such exceptional measures were justified. There is no drought, proclaimed an editorial in the Los Angeles Times. According to the Times editorial, the state's arid condition, dire though it was, should not be understood as a temporary aberration that could be mitigated through relief measures. It was not a deviation from the norm, but was rather the norm itself. We should not imagine that it is possible to return to a previous condition, the editorial argued. We must adapt to the world as it is, not as we remember it. The implication of the Times editorial was that large swaths of California's Central Valley, where 6.4 million acres of farmland are irrigated, might have to be removed from agricultural production. And although the Times editorial targeted agricultural use, it's also worth noting that the 19 million residents of urban Southern California also depended on precarious supplies of imported water. Indeed, as the period of dire water scarcity continued into the spring of 2022, parts of the Southern California metropolitan region that are dependent on the State Water Project, which, as I'll describe later, carries water from the delta in Northern California down south to LA, um, parts of this region were subject for the first time ever to emergency water rationing. While struggles over water among endangered fish, big agriculture, and thirsty cities were not new to California, the conflict had taken on a more urgent tone given changing patterns of precipitation due to global warming. As the state's Department of Water Resources noted, California's infrastructure of water provision, built in the mid-20th century, was designed based on fairly reliable historical patterns of precipitation. So the system transports water from the mountains in the north and east of the state, where precipitation tends to be concentrated, to the cities and farms of the coasts and the Central Valley. Since most of the state's precipitation falls during the winter, the system relies on the accumulation of a large mountain snowpack as a reserve during the dry season, gradually capturing and storing snowmelt in reservoirs before sending flows southward over the course of the summer. Given the dependence of the arid regions of the state on this large-scale infrastructure, the condition of drought in California is best seen not as a lack of precipitation per se, but rather as a question of whether the system is able to deliver expected allocations of water to its users. A crucial bottleneck in this system is the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, east of San Francisco Bay, where large pumping plants divert water to the state and federal projects that then deliver it to urban and agricultural users to the south. The problem for water managers is that the Delta is at once the hub of the state's water infrastructure and the home of several species of endangered fish, which are subject to protection under the Endangered Species Act. The most famous of these fish, which you all may have even heard of, is the humble Delta smelt, which was called a stupid little fish by Republican Devin Nunes of the Central Valley and has long been vilified by Donald Trump. But at the same time, several other species of fish, including salmon, steelhead, and sturgeon, are also listed as endangered and protected by Endangered Species Act regulations. According to the Federal Endangered Species Act, if the action of a government agency threatens to jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species or damage its critical habitat, the agency must consult with wildlife officials about how to mitigate this threat. So in the case of California's water infrastructure, the action in question is the very operation of the state and federal water projects that pump water from the Delta to the south. Shifting flows and diverting water within the Delta continuously threatens the survival of native fish species. And for this reason, water project operators must work closely with wildlife agency regulators to make decisions about how much fresh water can be exported from the Delta on a daily basis, and how much will be allowed instead to flow along the Delta's historical course out to the bay and then to the ocean. And they're guided in this collaboration by regulations that are laid out in a document that's called the Biological Opinion, which examines whether project operations are harming listed species, and if so, prescribes alternative actions that can allow project operations to proceed. So for instance, the Biological Opinion sets a threshold on the total number of what are called incidental takes, and this refers to the harm or death of an endangered species of fish that would trigger orders to curtail pumping rates. So one problem for project operators is that the pumping machinery can reverse the direction. I'm going to see if I can show you this image. The pumping machinery and these two red dots sort of to the right lower hand of the image on the right are the state and federal water projects. The pumping machinery at these projects can reverse the direction of river flows within the Delta, pulling endangered species of fish to be entrained within the pumps. And as a result, endangered species regulations often require diversions to be slowed down, which allows so-called excess water to flow into the bay, to the consternation of the state's water agency managers. And this was a theme of a presentation I attended last March, about a year ago, at a meeting of the Metropolitan Water District's One Water and Stewardship Committee, which reports on supplies of water imported to Southern California via the State Water Project. At this meeting, Metropolitan staff informed the board that deliveries from the Bay Delta had been significantly curtailed over prior months due to regulatory requirements. Despite a series of recent storms, such regulatory obligations continued to have an impact on available supplies of water. And here, the agency's chief of Bay Delta Resources described an issue that was sharply limiting exports from the Delta. As she explained, a provision of the National Marine Fisheries Service's 2019 biological opinion designed to protect Central Valley steelhead had been triggered for the first time. The entrainment, that is the trapping of large numbers of steelhead near the pumping facilities at the south end of the Delta, had led water officials to significantly reduce the amount of water that could be diverted into the State Water Project. This is an image from the fish protection facility that's in the Delta, and this facility traps endangered fish that have been entrained by the pumps, and then releases them into what's ostensibly a safer part of the Delta elsewhere. It turns out that predator fish then gather at this site of release to eat the endangered species that are getting released. But in any case, it's supposed to be a way to save these endangered fish before they get sucked into the Delta's pumps. Staff at the facility count the fish that have been caught, and if the number counted reaches a certain threshold, they're automatically required to reduce pumping rates. So at the meeting of the Metropolitan Water District that I was attending, the chief of Bay Delta Resources warned that by the end of the month, this unprecedented regulatory intervention could reduce exports on the project by as much as 46,000 acre-feet. Acre-feet is the standardized measurement of water in the water resources management world. However, she continued, it was not actually clear from the data whether the fish were literally being entrained. And so metropolitan scientists were now on hand. They'd been sent to the Delta to support in the effort to track the location of the fish and to adaptively manage the system, which they hoped would lead to an easing of the regulatory restrictions. Just to give you a little bit of detail on how this regulatory process works, and it's just a question of counting trapped fish. So this tension between human and environmental needs will be exacerbated, most likely, by global warming. According to climate models, the future will bring not an overall decrease in precipitation to California, but rather precipitation will arrive in a different pattern. There will be volatile swings between periods of aridity and deluge. Water will fall more often as rain than as snow in the mountains, and earlier springs will lead to a rapidly disappearing snowpack. So the threat of future water scarcity due to climate change in California comes not from less overall rainfall, but rather from dependence on an infrastructure that was built for a different climate. The implication for water managers is that in the future, a higher percentage of storm flows will have to be captured and stored rather than being allowed to course through the Delta to serve environmental demands, such as protecting migratory fish. As the director of the Department of Water Resources recently noted, since the state's winter storms come in intense short bursts, the task will be to take advantage of these storms to transport and store as much water as possible in the state's reservoir, just to the south of the Delta, the San Luis Reservoir, pictured here. So with that context in mind, let me now return to the setting that I began the talk with, the period of extreme aridity in California between 2020 and 2022, and the problematic of emergency. In October of 2021, so still in the middle of the drought, 6 months after the Los Angeles Times editorial describing the situation as the new normal, Governor Newsom did in fact proclaim a statewide drought emergency. Among other things, the declaration provided the state's water managers with operational flexibility. The pumping restrictions that were laid out in the biological opinion to protect endangered species could be suspended during storms in order to supply water to drought-afflicted areas. So this was the effect of the declaration of emergency. Where water flowed during the period of the drought emergency would be a matter of meeting urgent needs as defined by the governor, rather than following regulatory requirements. A year later, in early 2023, relief from the state's historic period of water scarcity seemed to finally arrive after a series of major winter storms filled reservoirs and boosted the state's snowpack. So you can see the contrast between 2022 and 2023 in this image, when the state finally officially moved out of drought. But if the drought was apparently over, the emergency was not. In February 2023, just after all of these storms had arrived, the governor issued a new executive order that did not rescind, but in fact extended the drought emergency. Citing the increasing frequency of hydrologic extremes and the need to promote resiliency in a changing climate, the order authorized the state's Water Resources Control Board to modify requirements governing the flow of water through the delta so that recent storm flows could be captured and stored in project reservoirs for later use. So even in the presence of apparently ample water supplies, the prospect of future scarcity served as justification to continue the period of official emergency. Environmentalists and fishing industry advocates vehemently protested this extension of the drought emergency. As an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council said, the continued suspension of endangered species regulations signaled the governor's intention to put his thumbs on the scale in favor of extinction in the Delta. And as the president of the Golden State Salmon Association put it, alluding to the series of recent storms, Newsom claims he's using his authority, his emergency authority. What emergency is he responding to? I would suggest that the drought emergency declared by Newsom was due not to water scarcity per se, but rather to a lack of fit between the infrastructure of water provision and changing patterns of rainfall linked to climate change. This period of water scarcity, whether officially declared a drought emergency or not, illustrates some familiar points about emergency government. As the condition of scarcity intensified, existing preparedness measures were put into motion. For instance, the implementation of drought contingency plans by local water districts, or the use of stockpiled reserves by Southern California water managers to stave off the need to ration. But in considering the question that I posed at the outset of the talk, how the ongoing climate emergency is being governed in relation to specific climate-related events, it's helpful to linger on the governor's strategic use of the category of emergency as a means to provide officials with the capacity for flexible water management. This temporary measure mirrored the state's longer-term strategy for managing the effects of climate change on water supplies. Hydrology models indicated that the anticipated change in patterns of precipitation would lead to a significant decrease in average state water project allocations to farms and cities. Again, this was not because there would be less overall precipitation, but because the system as currently configured would not be capable of capturing major storm flows during winter months, due in large part to pumping restrictions within the delta to protect endangered fish, the very restrictions that Newsom suspended in his executive orders. As a result, water managers would have to find a way to catch storm flow for later use, or risk losing it altogether, as the Department of Water Resources put it. For this reason, a centerpiece of California's climate adaptation strategy is a large-scale infrastructural investment that would enable state water project operators to capture Sacramento River water before it enters the ecologically sensitive zone of the Delta. This ambitious, if still provisional, attempt to transform the system of water provision is an attempt to resolve through engineering the temporal contradiction between the inexorable effects of climate change on the one hand and the temporal boundedness of emergency government on the other. The plan, known as the Delta Conveyance Project, is to construct a 45-mile long, 37-foot diameter tunnel underneath the delta at an estimated cost of $20 billion. The envisioned tunnel would have diversion points north of the delta to redirect storm flows into the project's pumps and then move them to storage facilities to the south. By avoiding the delta's waterways, that is, by coursing beneath them, these flows would not be subject to the regulations that protect endangered fish and guard against salinity intrusion. Another way to think about the conveyance project is that it would infrastructurally embed the operational flexibility that was temporarily implemented via Newsom's emergency declaration. The state's water managers describe this tunnel project as a climate adaptation or climate resilience project, in that it does not seek to capture more water into the system, but rather protects against future water supply losses due to climate change. In this sense, it is not a return to the mid-20th century era of large-scale modernizing infrastructure, such as the dams, pumping plants, and canals that anchor the state's water projects, but rather is designed to sustain the operations of a vital, vulnerable system in the face of anticipated shocks. At the same time, and for this reason, its fate remains uncertain, the tunnel project also poses the question of whose future water supply losses are to be mitigated, and therefore who is supposed to pay for it. As it's currently planned, the cost of the tunnel is to be borne by those water users who depend on the operation of the state water project. Since the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California receives roughly half of the total allocations from the state water project, its customers, the 19 million people who live in the region, are being asked to pay for a significant proportion of its construction. For Metropolitan, the decision about such investment is not an obvious one, given that the conveyance project requires a commitment in the immediate term to a project that would not be completed until at least 2045. And such a decision must be made without definitive knowledge of what climate scenario will unfold, how regulatory requirements may change, or the scale of future demand in the region. Metropolitan planners describe this situation characterized by a new level of volatility in which it is no longer possible to rely on historical data to anticipate what may come in the future as one of deep uncertainty. Given the need, despite such uncertainty, to decide in the present about long-term investments, such as the Delta Conveyance, the agency has developed a planning approach that addresses the need for flexibility, which they call adaptive management. This approach involves, as its climate adaptation planning framework puts it, an iterative process of reading signposts to understand the real-world conditions and determine if the agency's time-based targets need to be revised. So, for example, the agency might track which of its 4 different climate change scenarios has been most closely actualized as it revises its calculation of anticipated storage needs. Adaptive management means that the agency's investment decisions remain provisional, at least in principle, and are to be regularly revised in relation to changing baseline conditions. So I'll conclude here. When it comes to water scarcity in California, the climate emergency is not the punctuated event of drought per se, but rather the challenge of sustaining infrastructural access to flows in the context of an ever-changing baseline. For future periods of water scarcity, avoiding catastrophe will mean having already invested in climate-resilient infrastructure. But given the lack of a stable planning baseline, this means continually monitoring the changing present as part of an iterative process of constituting targets for future transformation, lest investments prove a mismatch for altered conditions. So one must, it seems, be prepared not for a future emergency with its promise of closure and return to the status quo, but rather for a condition of ongoing, relentless volatility. With your indulgence, I'm going to close with a quick update on this story. And I want to note that even though California has had a relatively good year for precipitation, the extended drought emergency that Newsom declared back in 2021 continues into the present. But the dynamic has been complexified by the role of the federal government under Donald Trump, who, of course, is no friend to endangered species. On January 31st of this year, Governor Newsom issued an executive order to maximize the capture of water during a series of upcoming winter storms. His order came just a week after the White House issued what looked like a similar order, directing the Secretaries of Interior and Commerce to, quote, immediately take actions to override existing activities that unduly burden efforts to maximize water deliveries. So Trump had made the order basically to override endangered species protection to maximize deliveries from Northern California to the Central Valley and to Southern California. Indeed, environmental and fishing advocacy groups described Newsom's order as alarmingly similar to federal directives from President Trump. As a conservation biologist with San Francisco Baykeeper put it, the only explanation for this move at this time is that Newsom is feeling the political need to prove that he supports diverting as much water or more than Donald Trump. Trump's order focused particularly on the endangered species protections that restricted water project operations and instructed officials to find ways to suspend or rescind regulations impeding the diversion of water from the Delta. Newsom's order, in fact, was more circumscribed. It reprised elements of his earlier emergency declarations, stating that there were ongoing significant impacts from the recent drought that remained to be mitigated. Newsom's order again directed the Department of Water Resources to maximize diversions of excess flows that become available as a result of anticipated winter storms, so that those supplies could be stored in reservoirs and groundwater basins. While the governor's order referred to the drought emergency, the temporality of this emergency was ambiguous. As Newsom put it, we are creating a literal rainy day fund to help us recover from a multi-year drought and prepare for a hotter, drier future. In other words, the goal was as much to address a present situation extending indefinitely into the future as it was to mitigate the effects of the drought that had officially ended 2 years earlier. As a spokesman for the Golden State Salmon Association noted, the order appeared open-ended. This order isn't even pretending there's a drought emergency. It's simply saying, let's suspend environmental laws because it's raining. Following Newsom's directive, the State Water Project was able to increase its pumping rates during the early February storm from 1,800 cubic feet per second to 3,000 cubic feet per second, and put this water into a reservoir south of the Delta. And it was able to capture an additional 16,000 acre feet of water for summer storage. Meanwhile, the Department of Water Resources noted that the Delta Conveyance Project, if it had been built already, would have enabled the capture of a far greater amount of storm flows over the course of the winter. As the department announced, it would have been hugely beneficial had the project been in place, making it possible to capture more than 700,000 acre feet of additional storage, enough for 7 million people. But until and unless such an infrastructure of flexible storm capture has been concretized, it remains necessary to rely on emergency declarations to continually, if always temporarily, suspend statutory regulations that protect endangered species. So with that, I'll stop, and I very much look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. That was a really very interesting talk, and appreciate your perspectives on this. I certainly learned a lot, even though I know a fair amount about California water systems and management. So this was very useful for me. So thank you. So I will open it up to see if there are any questions from the group. If not, then I can start with one too. Yeah, Christine, go ahead if you'd like.
Hi, nice to see you, Andy. My question is that this is super interesting. I'm curious about like where do the shift toward the changes, like with the building that big underground reservoir, is that sort of paradigm shift happening? Does that like a top-down decision or like a bottom-up kind of decision? I'm just wondering about like where, like who the people are who are deciding to make those changes. And maybe, as you kind of alluded toward the end, maybe there's some kind of political opportunism that can kind of come into that situation. So what happens, I guess, who makes the decisions and what happens when sort of actual current politics kind of intersects with the sort of bureaucracy and kind of inertia, technical stuff of the people who are actually working on these things, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really complicated story for those who've been following it. And Paul, it sounds like you know something about California water, so you can add any of your thoughts to this too. So this is in some ways a continuation of an attempt to modernize the water infrastructure that's been ongoing for about 40 years or so or more, which was initially called the Peripheral Canal. And became, instead of a canal that would go around the east of the delta, would go a tunnel that would be constructed under. And under Jerry Brown, there was a 2-tunnel project proposed that was simplified to a single tunnel project by Newsom to try to pacify critics and sort of show that not that much water would be sucked down from the Sacramento River into the tunnel. So it's been a proposal that this state water officials have been pursuing for decades, and this is the current iteration of it. And the question has been how, and it was turned down by California voters. Getting to your question of how the decision gets made, the Peripheral Canal was turned down by California voters in the 1980s, and so as a means of financing it and getting it approved, a different strategy is being used for the tunnel, which is to have the users of the water, i.e. the water agencies along the state water project, pay for its construction. And so the process is not being opened up to a general vote. And it's really a question of whether, there's a whole bunch of regulatory hurdles that continually have to be passed to make it happen. But in terms of financing, it's a question of whether each of the water agencies that would get the water are willing to put down the investment necessary to start construction. So the decision has been sort of pushed to these boards of directors of water agencies, and then meanwhile there are suits against it by environmental advocacy organizations and fishing advocacy organizations. So that's a very simple version of it. Paul, did you want to add anything about the politics?
No, not so much about the politics. I think that was a really nice answer. It still goes along these lines of, and as an engineer, we're very good at thinking about command and control, right? And so build more infrastructure, which yes, it costs money, but build more infrastructure to limit our risks. And there will always be a role for that. But I guess maybe along those lines, and what I'd like to hear from you too, Andrew, is right. So that's one approach. Another approach, which takes longer time and is not necessarily easy, is really these changes in policy, these changes in behaviors, which maybe in a simplified way get at the demand side of things as opposed to building more infrastructure, which gets at the supply side of things. And so what do you hear, or what do you see that's trying to address this from the demand side? And I remember some years ago when there were restrictions in California, right? There were some mandatory restrictions, and it sounded great from the outset in that it was, but really those restrictions ended up being on domestic use, not agriculture, and 1%. And if you looked at the total water volumes, it ended up being like a restriction of a few percent, even though it sounded big, right? Because agriculture, we all know, is the dominant one there. So California, I'll admit I eat avocados and almonds, right? I mean, it's not going to change overnight, but are there some shifts or discussions that you hear some conversations about?
Yeah, I mean, and you're alluding to probably two quite different discussions about water use in California. And one of the discussions focuses on the agricultural sector and whether, for example, farmland will be need to be fallowed, or whether there need to be some ways of incentivizing people to grow crops that use less water. So not so many almonds, for example. Um, and that, is its own dynamic. And there's also a question of whether agricultural users even want to or are able to pay for their portion of this project. So that's a kind of open question. And in fact, the federal water project, I didn't talk about the details of it, but the federal water project goes mostly to the Central Valley, to farmers. And those water contractors have turned down the opportunity to participate in this project. So it's really just the state water project. And the state water project actually serves more urban users than the federal one does. And I think at least half, I don't know quite the amount, at least half of the water goes to urban use. And so then this other discussion about the future of urban use is what's at stake in whether places like Los Angeles will invest in the tunnel. And is the region going to grow? It's not clear. The advocates for the tunnel argue that the kinds of measures, Paul, that you alluded to of reducing water use, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked in some ways, that in fact the region has grown without increasing its total water usage over the last couple of decades, but that because climate change will diminish the availability of water given the current infrastructure, if the region wants to grow, it's going to have to figure out how to get more water. And so there's kind of at least two big proposals on the table for that. One of which is this big conveyance project, and another of which is figuring out how to locally reuse water, whether that's trapping more stormwater or reusing treated wastewater. And that's one of the big fights at the regional level in Southern California. And one way to characterize it would be kind of doubling down on the existing infrastructural system in which a lot of the water used in Southern California depends on imports, versus really transforming the system so that local water is captured and reused. In terms of your question about political opportunism, Christine, can you say a bit more about what you had in mind there?
You just talking about the governor, maybe is he trying to align himself with the president? And, because now we see there's other things kind of seem to be happening with that. And I don't really know how to think about that. It just, when things change, this is sometimes people step in when things are changing and falling apart. And sometimes people see that as an opportunity. So I just don't know how that fits into this.
Yeah, I think, all bets are off given the current administration. I don't think I or even Gavin Newsom quite know what's going to happen with the Department of Interior. And, this is another story that I didn't go into, which is really interesting vis-a-vis the federal approach to endangered species regulations, because that order that I alluded to, this is one of these dozens of executive orders that the Trump administration issued the very first day he entered office on January 20th. That executive order directed the Department of Interior and Commerce to do something that has never really been done before, which is to convene this group of officials, to regularly convene this group of officials, which are known colloquially as the God Squad, and they are allowed to override. Legally, they're ostensibly allowed to override endangered species protections in the case of an urgent or emergency situation. And so there was Trump declared an energy emergency. And so the idea is to override endangered species protections that might block, pipeline projects, for example. But that energy emergency is also being used to make the case for overriding the endangered species regulations that protect fish in the Delta. So I think there will obviously be objections in the court to this, and so we'll see how it unfolds over the next couple of years. But I think what the opportunistic move would be for Newsom is not clear yet at this point.
Are there some other questions from our participants?
I can,
Yeah,
yeah, hey there. Well, hi, Andy. Thanks so much for the talk. It's super interesting. I'm like Paul, I'm a hydrologist, but I did my master's at UC Davis, so I know a little bit about the stories behind some of these things. But I'm going to kind of ask a question that's totally out of my realm of expertise, but I've been thinking about a lot, and it has to do with kind of the political situation. And I feel like this turn towards kind of emergency management and framing things in terms of emergencies is kind of in tandem with this move towards more executive power. And as kind of a hydrologist and researcher, I'm facing this research endeavor that is trying to look at the future and try to predict the future to have better water management. Like Paul and I might talk about it in terms of non-stationarity, right? Like stationarity is dead. We have to now account for these future changes somehow, but it's awkward because we don't know what the future is going to be. And I keep thinking about how do we incorporate other perspectives and views and kind of integrate it with a democratic process, right? And so you have on one side emergencies that tend to get captured by like executive power, but then on the other hand, like I see this desperate need to like think long term and have a democratic process, which is more on kind of the representative democracy side of things. And so I don't know. Do you have any words of wisdom on how we navigate this huge conundrum, and any advice for scientists too to like better frame this?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to be able to give you good advice, but I
Yeah.
will maybe provide some historical context, which could be interesting. I think you're quite astute to link emergency declarations to executive power. I think the historical context to understand is that these provisions were built up really in the 1930s and 1940s when there was a criticism made that democratic forms of government, liberal democracies, liberal constitutionalisms were incapable of responding to acute emergencies, whether it was an economic crisis like the Great Depression or the vast mobilization necessary for World War II. And so political theorists like Carl Schmitt, the German jurist, argued, the executive needs to be able to become a dictator and make decisions rapidly and flexibly, given the dictates of a given situation. And these administrative reformers in the U.S. said, wait a minute, we can figure out a method whereby we would preserve democracy, but we would still enable the executive to flexibly respond to unfolding and unpredictable emergency situations. And that's what this form of emergency government that consists of sort of time-bound declarations that actually are built into the law. There's actually laws saying here's what you can and can't do during a future emergency. So the idea was to constrain the executive, but nonetheless give the executive some flexibility. So that's a kind of historical viewpoint. On the other hand, it becomes a double-edged sword because the executive does have the capacity to unilaterally declare these emergencies, as we just saw with the quote energy emergency, which is clearly a dubious emergency given that we're already producing record amounts of oil and natural gas. So I think the task would be, I think, to push against this overuse of emergency authority, but nonetheless be attuned to the fact that the classic, as you're alluding to in your question, the classic liberal democratic process of moving through legislation is a slow one and an arduous one. And so that's a non-answer to your question, but at least a bit of historical context for it.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that.
These are great questions. I appreciate all the questions. I think we have time for one or perhaps two more if anyone has one. Yeah, Andrew, please.
Yeah, thanks for this very much. It was a great talk. And I just sort of piggybacking on that last discussion, I'm curious what your thoughts are. I mean, you referenced the Depression and sort of the beginnings of this and one of the things that I've always sort of argued, I should say my background, I'm trained as a historian of science and medicine. One of the things I've always argued about sort of the Depression, and I've argued this about COVID and other sort of major sort of emergencies, right, is that they provide a context for allowing you to kind of deeply rethink governmental structures, right? So you get the New Deal, after COVID, you look at things like, something like universal school meals, which would have just been politically completely impossible 6 or 7 years ago. All of a sudden, you've got states passing legislation left and right with a different federal government. It wouldn't even be impossible at the federal level, that kind of thing. And those are themselves not emergency responses, but they emerge out of emergency responses, right? So the emergency response basically gives people a taste of what life could be like under a different sort of set of governmental structures. And if that taste is desirable enough, right, then you get the political mobilization to actually make it a reality. And the situation you're talking about is a little bit more complicated in some ways. And I should also confess that I'm a native Californian. I grew up in the Bay Area, and like I've lived through a lot of those droughts, and I remember water rationing and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's a little different when you're talking about like a natural resource and a sort of natural resource conservation context, because like the number of sort of power players involved and whatnot, it gets much more sticky in some ways, as you very nicely, I think, characterized in your talk. But I'm curious of your thoughts around that side of emergency declaration or emergency power, as sort of the second stage of what happens, sort of like outside the emergency response itself, and how it sort of what potential there might be in this case for a kind of reshaping of how we think about these problems sort of in a fundamental level. Like, does it change the causal stories? Does it change the whatever the Overton window, whatever it is, like that, like sort of shifts the kind of fundamental kind of way that people actually think about it, as a sort of social issue?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I'm going to think out loud a little bit because I haven't really processed that question before. And as you say, if you think about the New Deal or World War II, those were events that radically transformed the role of government in collective life, and because whether it was the Roosevelt policies vis-a-vis the Depression, or the mass mobilization, economic mobilization directed by the government in the lead up to World War II, or the role of government in science policy, which there's a lot of conversation about now, that is again a result of the World War II mobilization. You have this, as you say, a kind of opportunity to transform the role of government in public life that is taken up from the emergency, but then has a much longer lasting impact. And the example you cited around COVID is intriguing because of course things like industrial policy, the IRA Act was arguably possible because of these massive stimulus packages that were passed and seemed to be successful and seemed not to generate huge amounts of inflation, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly.
So there were economic policies during COVID specifically to address COVID that seemed to open up new ways of thinking about what the government could do. Climate change is really interesting this way, and this is sort of the initial framing of this talk, because of course it is this vast emergency that and the IRA Act was sort of a subtle attempt to take advantage of it in some ways, or I shouldn't say take advantage of it, but address it. But by the same token, it doesn't have the characteristics of war or pandemic, of a kind of acute, itself acute and immediately addressable. It has this much more ongoing, indefinite characteristic and all-encompassing characteristic. And so I think it's harder to, for all the political reasons you all know about, to galvanize the public around, addressing climate change via massive government intervention. And it probably could only become possible if these events, like whether it's wildfires or hurricanes and so on, are actually collectively conceived of as part of the same problem, and that seems to be sort of the hiccup. So there is political agreement that the government is responsible for dealing with a hurricane response. That it's one of the few things about which there seems to be bipartisan agreement. But you somehow can't convert that into political agreement that the government should be addressing, massively addressing climate change as a whole. And so it's that linkage of the acute event to the general ongoing event that I think is the gap here.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I mean, just to just quickly comment on that, I mean, I think that's a common problem. I mean, you see this in public health, for example, like, epidemics are big and noticeable, but, in many cases they're cyclical or predictable to some degree. And, the larger patterns tend to get ignored for the sort of immediate response. I mean, I don't think it's unique to climate change in that sense that like natural disasters are similar, right? Like they're not predictable in their specifics, but they're predictable on and like the sort of general frequency and that kind of thing. And so that I think that's probably a more general issue with the way that we socially organize and think about these things. But yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, emergency is inherently, as a governmental construct, inherently constructed to be temporary and acute. And that necessarily limits its capacity to create long-term sustaining change.
Well, thank you very much. Let's thank Andrew again for the talk.